Hi everyone, welcome back to the Ocean Friendly Garden Maintenance webinar series. Today we'll be talking about the mulch requirements that are in the Ocean Friendly Gardens. I will be your presenter once again. My name is Llewellyn Swayzer and I'm the lead horticulturalist at Swayzer Landscapes, and we are currently maintaining some of the Ocean Friendly Gardens. So we'll be talking about the mulch requirements for Ocean Friendly Gardens. I'll talk about some soil fertility and mulch benefits. We'll talk about mulch materials that you can possibly use for the gardens. And then finally, we'll talk about installing the mulch. So once again, we start here, Ocean Friendly Gardens. We're definitely considering the ocean in every action that we make. We're considering all waterways in every action that we make. So no chemicals, no fertilizers. And so we obviously knew that pesticides are always highly in the conversation, like these are dangerous, don't use them. So that's an obvious one. But fertilizers are also in that conversation, especially when we're talking about waterways, because we don't want fertilizers to reach our waterways. Because there's a very bad thing that can happen, and they are called algae blooms. And so algae blooms are the result of excess nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizer running off from agricultural or horticultural or just regular commercial industries and reaching the waterway. And what happens is that these aquatic plants, which respond to fertilizer just like land plants do, they'll have an excess of growth. And in doing that, they are pretty much wreaking havoc on the ecosystem. And it's of no fault of their own because they are just simply plants. But this is something we should limit. So algae blooms can be very harmful. They can secrete toxins. They can deplete the oxygen of ocean. They deplete the oxygen in the ocean, and they can also cause massive fish die-offs. So even though the amount of fertilizer that we may be applying to our garden or whatever is small, if there is the possibility that it can run off and eventually reach the ocean, we are contributing to the potential of there being a large algae bloom event. So that's something we want to avoid, especially since we are ocean friendly gardens, and we want to be friendly to the ocean. So we don't even look in the direction of fertilizers because of this. And so here's the criteria for ocean friendly garden soil and mulch. So soil is healthy, maintained organically without chemical additives. Soil health is maintained by the addition of compost tea, and worm castings, which worm castings are called vermicompost. A minimum of 2 to 4 inches of natural mulch. Soil is not visible beneath the mulch layer except for areas around the crown of woody plants that should remain unmulched and around the trunks of trees. And I'll talk about why a little later. These unmulched areas should be minimized, but the amount of space between the mulch and the trunk or the crown of the trees is due to the size of the tree. So a very large tree, you're gonna obviously want to back up a little more, and then a smaller tree, you can come in a little more. And then obviously no pesticides, no herbicides, no fungicides or synthetic fertilizers, and no landscape fabric or wheat cloth. And wheat cloth is used quite a lot, and I think it's a old school technology almost that we're still using in landscape. Though initially it may help to suppress weeds, it eventually becomes tangled in the roots of the plants and it has to be cut out, and so it's more difficult in the long run. So I would suggest that we stop using it all around, because I have seen it have to be cut out from roots too many times. So no weed fabric, especially in these gardens. Okay, soil fertility. So I'll talk about it in a very basic sense. So soil fertility is is the soil's capacity to supply nutrients to plants. And it's obviously something that's really important, and it comes down to having a O layer, which is organic layer, and the A layer, which is the surface or the topsoil that can supply adequate nutrients and also have adequate structure and supply moisture to the plants. And so we commonly think of plants needing fertilizer in some way, but when we're adding fertilizer, we're only supplementing what the soil can't do. So if we can build up our soil and use plants that have a lower fertility requirement, much like all of our ocean-friendly plants, then we don't need to add anything extra and we can just depend on the soil fertility. And so when we're adding mulch on the top of the soil, what we're doing is trying to protect the O layer or the humus and protect the topsoil. Because if they erode, then that's wiping out a lot of the nutrients that were available to the plants. And so that's something important, and that's the basis of everything that we're doing here on out. Native plants don't need fertilizer though, and that's a good thing. California native plants are adapted to the soil that we have here. That's why they're native. And obviously there are some plants in the gardens that are not native and they're more climate specific and they work well for our climate, which is great. They also usually won't need a large amount of fertilizer, and that's also something to consider when you're looking at plants to replace with. Make sure that they fit in the scope of the fertility of the other plants that are there. You don't want a plant that needs very heavy feeding put in place with all of these California natives, because then it kind of throw everything off and they'll suffer in some way. So no synthetic fertilizer, but we don't even use organic fertilizer. So organic fertilizers are fertilizers that are made from plant material, animal droppings, bone meal, stuff like that. And these plants don't need that either. And that's the benefit of having these gardens. And I think as we come into like the last topic, one thing that we should notice is that everything is relatively easy when it comes to these gardens. In landscaping, we have a lot of difficult tasks. Like think about the comparison of running something really, really high maintenance, like a turf grass, and then we pull all the way back to the other side of these gardens, which are really low maintenance, which, you know, makes them easy and enjoyable. And so the plants, they generally do not need and they do not want supplemental fertility. So, you know, they may not respond well to fertility anyway, and so that's why we resist from applying fertility. And they haven't received any, and the plants look great, so that goes to show that it's working out just fine. And so since they don't need fertility, I did mention earlier a part of the criteria is that they do, if you want to add something to the soil, you can add compost. And so compost is a soil amendment. Compost is made up of decomposing organic material. So plant debris, kitchen scraps, you know, all these types of things, they're put in a pile, the pile is turned and aerated, and eventually all of these things break down into this fine material that's called compost. And what compost can do, it can provide nutrients to the crops. A common misconception is that compost is fertilizer. It's not, it's a soil amendment, and in doing so, it's increasing the availability of nutrients to plants. And so it basically helps the soil to provide more nutrients for the plants. It acts as a soil conditioner. It increases the humus, so the organic material that is in the soil, increases the microbes. And so the microbes are doing a lot of the work in nutrient availability, especially for the big three, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. There are small microorganisms in the soil, and especially when you add more organic material, they can start working on the nitrogen that would not be available to plants otherwise, and then they make it available. So it's like part of the nitrogen cycle, and we aren't applying direct fertilizer, but we are helping the soil provide nutrients for these plants. It also improves soil structure. Soil structure is a very important concept for you know, roots being able to grow down, water being able to reach you know, in all the little crevices in the soil, and then the plants being able to draw that up. And so that's one option. Compost can be made, which is not a quick process. It takes a while for all that stuff to break down. But you can also buy compost. There's places that sell compost in a large bag, and it can be used for the same purposes. And then there's compost tea, which is basically just the liquid that is extracted from compost, and it extracts the beneficial organisms in a process of brewing. And so if you make your own compost or you buy some compost and you want to make the tea, it's somewhat simple. You just put it in a bucket in like a nylon stocking, and then you have a little aquatic pump that makes sure it's aerated, and then you brew it for about like 36 hours or something like that. And then you have this liquid material that you can then spray. You can also buy bags of compost tea. I've used this company before, Malibu Compost. I think they work pretty well. And once again, they're not fertilizer, but they will help with the microbial action that will help the soil provide nutrients to the plants. And so then it's either sprayed by, if it's a large area, a large sprayer, but then obviously you can use a backpack sprayer. People who use this at home, they'll just use a spray bottle and you'll just spray the plants. Sometimes people do both. They'll use compost and compost tea. I'm sure they have their reasons. I don't think anything is better than the other, but if you feel like you do want to add some nutrients or your plants are looking a little starved of nutrients, compost and compost tea. Also, worm castings can be used as a soil amendment to help. But once again, these plants, they thrive really well just on mulch alone. But if you do have a especially, nutrient heavy plant that needs a lot of nutrients, then this is something to consider. And these are, our few options that we have for these gardens. So can mulch provide the same benefits as compost? I just talked about how compost will help the soil, but mulch is obviously not compost. They're two different things. You can use compost as mulch, but the mulch that we are using is not necessarily labeled as compost. And so organic mulches, so like, the typical ones that we think of, like straw or bark, if they are decomposed or they decompose quickly, they can add the nutrients to the soil. And when I say nutrients, I'm talking about the same thing, microbes that provide the nutrients to the soil. And so they can do that. It depends on the state of decomposition, it depends on the material, and it depends on how quickly they're decomposed. Much like compost, mulch is not going to be a quick feeding situation. So if we use a fertilizer, especially a synthetic fertilizer, you can apply a fertilizer on your lawn and, the next day or within the week, you can see immediate results because immediately that nitrogen is going down, it's dissolving, going down into the soil, into the water, and going up into the roots of those plants. So it can be a very, very quick result. That's not the case in this. In this, we're more making sure the soil has good soil fertility so that when the plants do need nutrients, they're there, but it's not going to be a quick feeding situation. And so mulches can provide the same benefit as long as they're decomposing. So if you have a mulch that is a very coarse bark mulch, then obviously it's going to take a little bit longer to decompose versus if you use something like this, which is already decomposed quite a bit. So it all depends on the type of material that you desire to use in the locations. I prefer mulches that have started decomposing quite a bit because they are going to work a little bit quicker to provide the plants with some nutrients and help the soil structure. And these are, they're aesthetic first, and here we're looking more for weed suppression and nutrients. So what is a mulch? A mulch is any material that is spread or laid over the surface of the soil as a covering. And so one of the main benefits of mulch just off the bat is it reduces soil erosion. And so like I said, those top two layers of the soil are extremely important to the plant. They need these top two layers. That's where all the nutrients are that they pull from the soil. And so to protect them from going away in the rain or, flying away in the wind, we use mulch. And mulch can be very aesthetic, and it provides an aesthetic quality to all gardens that it's involved in. So mulch is important to ocean-friendly gardens, but mulch should be used in any planting, in any garden, in any landscape, just because of those benefits, and because soil is a very precious resource. Not every soil has the capability to grow plants, and so if you have the soil that has the capability to grow plants, it's best that we protect it as much as we can. And so here are some of the benefits of mulch, very simply. Without mulch, we'll have moisture loss, increased need for herbicides because, the weeds will just run wild. There's nothing stopping them. Increased weed growth, and so that would be kind of difficult because we maintain them once a month. So if the weeds were going crazy, you would come back and there would be just a lot of weeds. Poor soil structure, because it's not adding that organic material. Nutrient depletion from the weeds and the plants. There will be more competition for roots because of there's weeds. But with mulch, we can reduce the need for watering because mulch is really good at retaining moisture. It moderates the soil temperature. So if you're living in a very, harsh environment, or the garden is in a very harsh environment, it can moderate the soil temperature, which is good for the plants. It can improve plant growth, improves the soil by adding organic matter, improves the soil structure and the availability of nutrients, and it encourages the growth of worms and other soil organisms. And that is all leading to better soil fertility, protecting the soil fertility that we do currently have. And of course, weed suppression. When we're talking about these gardens, weed suppression is very important. Not every organic mulch has the capacity to suppress weeds. And so it depends on how thick the layer is. And so depending on the size of your material, you may need a thicker layer. So 2 inches of mulch is not necessarily going to work well for weed suppression. You want to go anywhere from 4 to 6, 6 if you're on the coarser side of material. So something to consider. And then if you're having a huge population of weeds, it may be that that layer has, eroded or it's broken down, and you may need to replenish the mulch and add more. Is my mulch harboring weed seeds? So that's an important question. It happens a lot. What you want to do is make sure that you're getting laboratory tested mulch, you have a trusted retailer, or you're getting certified mulch, certified compost, so that you're making sure that there's no weed seeds present, so you're not adding to the problem that already exists. What are the size of the particles? So if you have very large chunky particles, then it's easy for the light to go down into the soil profile and allow the weeds to grow tall and the seeds to germinate. So that's something that we need to consider. And then if the particles are too tiny, like the mulch is basically decomposed and it's all very small particles, that's just acting as a medium to grow weeds. And so that's also something to consider. You don't want to be too fine, you don't want to be too coarse to have good weed suppression. And then how quickly is my mulch decomposing? So paying attention to when you put the mulch in the lifespan of this mulch, and just looking at it, you can tell when a mulch is decomposing and breaking down. And that's when you need to start questioning, should I replace this mulch or should I replenish more mulch? And so weed suppression is not going to be 100%. We talked about weeds last time, and weed control is definitely going to be a multi-step program. You're using integrated plant management. So integrated pest management, excuse me. So you definitely, want to have this a part of it, but it's not going to be 100%. There are some weeds like nutsedge, with no matter what, it's going to come through the mulch, and so you definitely want to be removing those vegetative structures when you see nutsedge, because it will, surpass the mulch. And then if the mulch is too old or too fine or too large, this will allow weeds to grow. And weeds can actually grow on the mulch, like it can use the mulch as a medium. So these are all things you need to pay attention to, and you need to make sure that if you're not seeing good weed suppression, it may be one of these issues, and that can be adjusted going forward. So now I'm going to talk about some mulch material possibilities. And so mulches are split into organic and inorganic mulches. And so inorganic mulches are used to create barriers to weeds and prevent soil erosion. They have a high aesthetic value. There's no plant nutrients added because they are inorganic, and there's a minimal need for replacement. And so some inorganic mulches, rocks, decomposed granite, these are things that we see in gardens along with organic mulches, but these are not the kind of mulches that we're going to talk about laying down today. They are used in the gardens in other ways, decomposed granite and stuff like in walkways and stuff like that, but that's not what we're going to talk about applying, because once those are there, they're pretty good for a long while. We will be talking about organic mulches. And so this is living material that's decomposing over time and improves the soil structure. It's going to add plant nutrients, encourage beneficial soil microorganisms. And so, those are the nutrients that are coming from the microorganisms, and it's going to moderate the soil temperature, along with other things that I just mentioned that were the benefits of mulches. And so, like I was saying, many times these mulches are used with each other. So you can see in this image, you have a walkway that is decomposed granite, which is a type of inorganic mulch, but then you also have this brown wood mulch that is used, and that's an organic mulch. And they work well together because, you're covering all of the soil that you possibly can. And then you can see in this one, you have rock mulches, which are typically more expensive to do something like this on a commercial or a municipal level. So it's not done a whole bunch in gardens, but it's a possibility as well. But once again, we're not talking about inorganic mulches today. So here are some mulches that can potentially be used. So cocoa hulls, which are a good organic mulch. They are expensive, more expensive than the others. They do somewhat have poor weed suppression because they decompose so quickly, and the particle sizes break down. They do have a good smell that people like. The smell lasts for about a week or two, and people like the smell, so that's something to consider. And once again, they decompose quickly, but they will add, nutrients to the soil. They can last for up to 7 years, and that the lifetimes that I'm showing, this is a best case scenario. You will not likely get the 7 years out of this mulch, and you will have to consider replacing and replenishing all along the way. So if you have these mulches and you replenish like once a year, or once every 2 years, then you can possibly get that 7 years, but you can't just kind of like set it and forget it and look back in 7 years, because it's not gonna look good. Some of it's going to be blown away. It's going to be too fine particles. Then we have straw mulch, which is also popular mulch. Not recommended for native plants though. Commonly used in vegetable gardens and stuff like that. It is not the greatest for weed suppression, but it is good for water retention. It can be a fire hazard, and so, we are in California, so that's something to consider, considering the location of your garden. It has a very short lifespan though, so 3 months, and that's why it's oftentimes used for vegetable gardens. It'll last through, the season of whatever crop you have, and you'll replenish it maybe once, and then, you're done with it. But it is an option, but not for these gardens. Then you have bark mulch, which is available in 3 sizes: fine, medium, coarse. This is a good option. It is very decorative. It's somewhat like of a fancier mulch than you see in a large application, especially municipal. So it's commonly used in homes or very, very nice landscapes. Coarse bark will not work well for weed suppression just because there's so many spaces. But if you do want to use coarse bark, what you want to do is just add more inches. So instead of having like 2 to 4 inches, you want to have like 4 to 6 inches, and that will help with the weed suppression. It can last for a long time, 7 to 10 years, which once again, you're not going to get that full 10 years out of it unless you're maintaining it, taking care of it, replenishing it when necessary. Then we have pine straw, which is a good option. It's not used a lot in Southern California, but it's a good option. It's basically just the needles from pine trees. That is a mulch. You can get it for very cheap. It has a slow decomposition, so it'll decompose very slowly, so you won't get a huge, punch of nutrients as quick as you would another type of mulch that decomposes quickly. It's not the greatest for weed suppression because there's a lot of gaps in the spaces, but it is cheap, so that's why it's used, and it can last for 3 to 5 years. Then you have shredded redwood bark, which is also called gorilla hair. It has a slow decomposition. It does have insect repelling qualities that is found in the wood, and so you'll get those in your soil. It is flammable though, once again, so something to consider, Southern California. And it can last for 4 years with maintenance. And then we have the kind of mulch that I personally like the best for several reasons, or not the best, but the best for this application for several reasons. And so that's fluorospore mulch. And basically the whole goal of floor mulch is to replicate the forest floor. So it's composted tree clippings, and many times if you buy it from a local mulch facility, it will be local trees, and so that's really good for the environment because you're working in your ecosystem. It promotes microbe activity. It's been aged, and so composting has started. It's not very cheap, but it is a lower cost than some of the more fancy things like the bark mulch. And it can last for 5 to 7 years, once again, but you need to be looking at it on a yearly basis, replenishing, looking for bare spots, turning it and raking it. I'll talk about that at the end. And so that's fluorospore mulch. It works well for weed suppression as well. Here are some mulches to avoid, dyed mulches. And so these mulches are very popular because they are cheap. And they're cheap because they're old pallet construction wood that has been, just broken up and then dyed with a color. And the dye does not make them harmful to plants or anything like that. It's more about where does this wood come from. So a lot of this wood is treated wood that was used in some kind of construction application. And so those chemicals that it was treated with have the potential to leach into your soil. And so, it's obviously not something you want to do. And they do have a very, synthetic look to them. And so that's not something that we want to do for our gardens specifically. And so these are mulches that are not acceptable, even though they are, probably the cheapest amongst the wood type of mulches. So certified mulches are a thing, and so I mentioned it slightly last time, but there's also certified compost, and I want to bring this up just in case you want to go buy some compost to use for your gardens. So the certified compost program is basically they test the compost in a lab, and they give oversight to all the compost that goes in stores to give the consumers confidence that they're not putting anything on their plants that they shouldn't. And so you'll see this label on the bag, and that lets you know that it's certified by the U.S. Composting Council, and you can trust that this mulch is exactly what it says it is. It'll have the breakdown, the analysis of everything that's found in this mulch, and you can, have confidence that you're not spreading weed seeds or potentially having fungus or anything like that in your material. But then there's also certified mulch. And so certified mulch is typically more expensive because it hasn't went through a certification program. And it was developed to help consumers, retailers, regulators, and others identify products that conform to the voluntary uniform product guidelines for horticultural mulches, growing media, and landscape soils. And so you'll simply just see this label on the bag. If you go to Home Depot right now, you'll see this on a lot of their products. And you know, they'll cost a little bit more, but you will have peace of mind. Another option, if you don't want to buy certified mulch, and you can't find a large scale retailer for that, because once again, Home Depot is going to have, you know, bags of it. And if you want to mulch all the gardens, you're going to need a lot of bags. And so it's not the best economical thing to do. You can just find a trusted retailer with lab tested mulch or compost. And so what we do is we build relationships with the green recycling facilities. And so, you know, after we do our landscaping, all the plant debris, we'll take them to the, you know, green recycler. We'll take all the materials, and then they'll also be selling mulch, right? And so you can ask them for their lab test. Their lab test will tell you, you know, are there diseases present, chemicals, weed seeds, and then you can, you know, be comfortable that you're buying a mulch from someone that has put the effort into making sure that they're not spreading weeds or invasive plants like palm seeds. So you always want to have a trusted retailer, or you want to get some kind of certification for your plant material before, I mean, for your soil materials before you actually put them out, because you know, it can be bad if you spread something that has weed seeds in it, because then that's something you then have to go work with. And once you have weeds, like we said, that seed bank is pretty much always going to be there. So you want to make sure that you're doing the best you can to prevent these kind of things from happening. And so more about that forest floor mulch. Once again, it's the kind of mulch that we use for the gardens. It's the kind of mulch that I like the best personally for this application. And so it's produced from local composted tree trimmings. It is screened to the specification of ES2, which means that there will be a minus to 2 inches of material size, particle sizes. It's composted for 90 to 120 days. That means that the compost process has already started. That means there's going to be a higher amount of microbes that are present for the soil. It's a long-lasting aid for weed control because it is a mix of very small particles and larger particles all the way up to 2 inches. Then it works well for weed controls because it gives you that dense coverage that you need to suppress the weeds. It reduces evaporation from the soil surface. If we're watering a very small regulated amount, we want to make sure we keep that as much as we can. Once again, promotes soil microorganisms. That's because of that composting process that has taken place already. It's begun. And then the composting process is also really good because when composting is happening, it's producing a lot of heat, and that heat in turn is killing any potential weed seeds that may have been present. And it also prevents slope erosion, soil erosion on slopes. And so if you've ever been to the Manhattan Beach Garden, it is all essentially a slope. And so erosion could easily happen on that slope. And so that's also why you want to make sure you have a good layer of mulch that's good for soil erosion on slopes. And so I'm going to stop here for any questions before we go on.
Hi, Jennifer here. No questions have been received so far.
Okay. So now we'll talk about the mulch installation. And that's, you know, the easiest part between deciding and picking a mulch. Now you have it and you can install it. So when should you mulch? So early spring to early fall. This is a good time to mulch because plants receive a boost of nutrients and the soil is protected from rain runoff. And so, you know, right about now, when we're supposed to have rain coming in, this is a good time to mulch because you're protecting the soil. And then this is when the plants also are feeding. So you also want to make sure they have nutrients available for them in the soil. If you are using a mulch strictly for weed suppression, early January is a good time because this is just before the weed seeds are germinating. What is really important to consider is that maybe you applied it, you know, early spring. A good time to like go back and reassess early winter before the seeds start germinating, so you can kind of make sure that all the gaps are filled in, that, you know, you have your, you know, 2 to 4 inches or your 4 to 6 inches of mulch, so you're making sure that that weed suppression tool is in place for when the seeds start germinating. So how much mulch do you need? Obviously, I'm sure if you've ever laid down mulch, you might know this, but I figured why not add it. So 2 to 4 inches layer is needed for full benefits. If you want to smother weeds that are already present, or you have a large coarse particle size, 6 inches may be necessary. And so you can use a mulch calculator. There's mulch calculators that can be found everywhere on the websites to sell mulch, Home Depot, Lowe's, all of them have mulch calculators. Or you can use a calculation. And one reason that I do this, while it would be easy to just go to the mulch facility and say, you know, fill up the truck with all the mulch that I need, we also want to be cost effective in every way that we can possibly be. So getting just what you need is better than having a lot of access, even though you could potentially use it for somewhere else. And so the calculation is the square feet of the area times the desired inches divided by 12. That equals the cubic feet of material that you're going to need. If you have more than 25 cubic feet, you can convert it to cubic yards by dividing it by 27. And so I did an example calculation. And so this is if you have a 100 square foot garden, and then you'll end up with 33 cubic feet divided by 27. To get it to cubic yards, you'll need 1.2 cubic yards, and that is how mulch is measured out. You'll see it on the bag, or if you go to the green waste facility, they'll ask how many cubic yards you need. And so 1.2 cubic yards, or 16 bags that are 2 cubic feet a piece. And that lets you know how much mulch you will need. Once again, this is just a cost saving tip if you want to be exact with everything you do in the garden. Use the calculation. So tools needed, it's mulch. It's not a lot of science to it. Well, it is, but it's not, especially when it comes to installing it. So, you know, a big shovel or a small shovel, it's easier to use a big shovel, a wheelbarrow, and a rake to spread it. Nothing too big. If you want it to be extra, you know, particular about the amount of inches, you could potentially have a ruler or something to measure, you know, that 2 to 4 inches. So let's talk about the steps of installing the mulch. One, you want to hand pull the weeds prior to mulch application. And so there are some weeds that you could smother, but then you would have to be using that 6 inches. The best route to take is to go in the garden and weed, you know, hand pull all the weeds you can, including vegetative structures, and try to clean it out as much as you can. If you're using a different mulch, so if you decide I don't want to use forest floor mulch, I want to use something else, what you need to do is you need to remove the existing mulch, as much of it as you can. If you are composting, you want to add 1/4 to 1/2 inch. If you're adding it just to the top of the soil, if you're using it as a soil amendment, that means that you're gonna go in there and try to work it into the soil a little bit. You need 1 to 2 inches to amend the soil. If not, you know, you can use a wheelbarrow, and spreading your mulch, you just, you know, take it from your truck or whatever, put in the wheelbarrows, fill up the wheelbarrows, and then dump them in various spots around the garden, and then rake them out. Simply all that you're doing. And you want to spread it in an even layer at the desired inches. You want to make sure that you tell everyone that is on your crew the desired inches, so that one person's not, you know, making it really thick and then one person's making it really thin. So, and that happens. So that's something you want to consider, is letting everyone know, like, hey, we're working towards 4 inches today. This is 4 inches. This is how much we want each section to have. You also want to leave that clearance around the trunks of trees and the woody stems of plants, because that can cause rotting when the mulch is wet. So you want to leave that clearance, make sure you have that. And so the clearance that I'm talking about is pictured here. And so it is almost too common at this point that people make mulch volcanoes around trees. I don't know. This is another old school thing that was just happening and happening for a reason beyond my knowledge, that people were just doing. But mulch volcanoes is what we call them. They can lead to excessive soil moisture, and what they're going to do is cause root rot, disease problems, insect problems, because you're just exposing that woody bark to moisture constantly. Like it's just something wet sitting on that wood constantly, and that's definitely not what we want. It's going to weaken the tree. So especially if it's a young tree, so we don't want to do that. And remember earlier I said you want to have areas 4 to 12 inches around the crown of woody plants on mulch, and then 12 to 60 inches, depending on the size of the tree, around the trunks, should remain unmulched. And so you don't want to do volcanoes. You want to do something more like this. They're called donuts. So you make mulch donuts around, and you don't go up until the trunk of the tree. And the same with woody plants, because it will cause problems, especially if after a rain event that moisture is going to be sitting there for a while. An environmental tip that many people don't consider: leave a few small areas unmulched. So there's a lot of native bees that are ground burrowers, and so since we're a lot of times using native plants, they will attract native bees, and so you want to give them the capacity to live out their full life and do all their bee work, or biological things, by giving them some soil to ground burrow into. And that could be the soil that is around the trees, but you can also have little small other spaces that are free of mulch. And there's also many other beneficial insects that burrow, so something to consider. And so you have your mulch installed. And remember, like I said, that lifespan is definitely not a set it and forget it thing. You cannot lay the mulch down and then come back 7 years later and like, all right, well, I'm looking at the mulching and it's time to replace it. You have to take care of it all along the way. So raking the mulch is important to turn the material. So you end up doing this on accident, just cleaning up the garden sometimes. So it's a good thing to rake it out and move the material around, then make sure you have the depth that you desired in the first place. You also want to remove plant debris. So when you are weeding, when you are pruning, you want to make sure you remove that debris from the mulch surface. You want to check the dip, constantly. I would check, every time I visit the garden, because it's a huge part in your soil fertility, and it's also a huge part in your weed suppression. And to give this mulch the best chance to do both, fertility and weed suppression, it has to be at the right depth. You also want to check the color. Color is a clear sign that the mulch is aging or decomposing, and so that's when you need to ask yourself, should I be replacing or replenishing it if the color is much different from when it started? Also removing weeds, obvious, pulling out the weeds, but then also making sure that you're not just like pulling the weed from the top. You can also pull the mulch away, pull the weed, try to get as much as the roots, other vegetative structures, and then put the mulch back. Look for bare spots, and so inevitably there's going to be bare spots. Someone walked through it, a dog was digging, someone put a weed and didn't put the mulch back. All these things can happen. You want to make sure you have that uniform as possible coverage. Keep adequate circulation around woody plants, and so there can be times, once again, mulch is small material, it's going to move around. You want to make sure that you have adequate circulation, and you make sure you pay attention to that donut area that you created around this plant, and making sure that you keep it away from the woody stems. And you want to evaluate the effectiveness. And so, look at the mulch that you chose, whatever mulch you choose, and say, is this good at suppressing weeds? Am I having a lower incidence of weeds? Do my plants look nice and healthy? Consider all these things, and then maybe you can shift to another mulch or research what kind of mulch you want to use instead. So, evaluate the effectiveness, see what works best. And then, replenish or replace is a question that we have to ask ourselves. And so if you are replacing the mulch, and so if the mulch is completely old, you reach that 7 years, or you want to use a different mulch than is currently at the gardens, remove as much of the old mulch as you possibly can and then install the mulch. It makes it easier because you did do your calculation for a certain amount of inches. So you have a certain amount of material, and then you don't want it to just build so high that it's like spilling off of the garden. So remove as much as you can possible. And I know that can take a really long time, but it's ultimately worth it to get the maximum weed suppression and nutrient benefits from mulch. And if you are replenishing, you can check the thickness. And so if the thickness is getting a little bit low, you can remove some of the older mulch. And so, remove some. It's not as much as removing all of it, but I would take some of it off, especially the areas that look a little old, worn out. And then I would add back 1 to 2 inches of mulch. And so I'm not going all the way to bare soil, but I am taking a little bit off and then I'm replenishing it as we go. And so replenishing is definitely something you need to look at every 1 to 2 years. The mulch longevity depends on a lot of things. It depends on temperature, depends on human activity, animal activity, moisture, the climate in general. So definitely look at replenishing every 1 to 2 years. And after 5 to 6 years, consider a full replacement. And so even if you are not using a brand new mulch, and you want to put back that same mulch that's there, after 5 or 6 years, consider removing all that old material and then putting a fresh layer of mulch on, a fresh 2 to 4 inches or 4 to 6 inches, depending on the material. And that concludes our mulch requirements. Some things I want to leave you with. Choose the right mulch for weed suppression and nutrients, because these are two very important things that we need for these gardens. Because we cannot use herbicides, because we cannot use fertilizers, this is what we need our mulch to do for us. Only purchase mulch that is from a certified or trusted retailer. You don't want to be spreading weed seeds or fungi, so you want to look for that certification seal, or you want to have a trusted retailer that has lab tested mulch. Never place mulch against woody stems. No volcanoes, only donuts. They guarantee that the plants will get the benefits without any negative effects from the mulch. You want to maintain your mulch. Mulch is definitely not a set it and forget it, even if you're pulling weeds out. You want to rake it. You want to make sure you want to check the depth. You want to evaluate the effectiveness. And decide when to replenish or replace. On a year-to-year basis, you should be assessing this mulch and seeing where you should replenish. And then after that 5 or so years, or if it's not effective mulch, you want to be looking at, should I be replacing this mulch? So that includes our mulch requirement webinar. Next time we'll be talking about maintenance scheduling, where we put everything all together, all of the practices that we do in the garden. We will lay them out and see when they should be done, and when they should be scheduled. And that will be next Thursday at 10 a.m. Thank you for joining us. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me or Jennifer. Thank you.